Officer Brett Kowalski had been working hospital security overflow for 11 months, a rotation most officers in his precinct considered a soft assignment. Quiet corridors, bored waiting rooms, the occasional agitated visitor to calm down. In that time, he had developed a private habit that none of his supervisors had ever thought to question. He paid closer attention to who moved quickly through restricted areas than to why they were moving quickly. And he had never once, in 11 months, applied that scrutiny evenly. The woman who came through the emergency department's staff entrance at 11:47 that Thursday night was running. Not jogging, not hurrying, but running, full out, a badge clipped to her scrubs bouncing against her chest, a surgical cap still pushed back on her head from a procedure she'd left mid-stitch the moment her pager went off. Dr. Yolanda Freeman had been chief of surgery at Meridian General for 3 years, and in the 11 years before that, had built a reputation across 2 hospital systems for exactly this kind of response. The surgeon other doctors paged first when a trauma case needed someone who could move fast and think faster. Tonight's page had come from the ER, a 16-year-old boy, gunshot wound to the abdomen, losing blood pressure by the minute, a surgical team already scrubbing in and waiting on her to lead them. She had 6 minutes, by her own private estimate, before the boy's condition became unsurvivable, regardless of what anyone in that operating room did. Kowalski stepped directly into her path at the junction between the staff corridor and the restricted trauma bay hallway, one hand raised, the other resting near his belt. "Ma'am, this area is restricted. I need to see your credentials." "I'm a surgeon. I'm responding to a trauma page. I don't have time to stop right now." She tried to move past him, and he shifted to block her, his body language carrying the particular, immovable certainty of a man who had already decided, in the half-second it took to register a black woman running through a restricted corridor at midnight, exactly what kind of situation he believed he'd encountered. "I need you to stop and show me identification before you go any further." "My badge is right here." She gestured toward the ID clipped to her scrubs, still moving, trying to angle around him. "Dr. Freeman, chief of surgery. I have a 16-year-old patient bleeding out 40 feet from where we're standing." "Slow down. I can't verify anything if you keep moving." "I don't have time to slow down. Every second we're having this conversation is a second he doesn't have." Kowalski's hand shifted, not quite reaching for his weapon, but resting closer to it than the situation required. The particular escalatory posture of a man whose private certainty was hardening rather than dissolving in the face of her urgency. Reading her speed and her insistence, not as exactly what they were, a surgeon racing against a countdown only she fully understood, but as further confirmation of whatever suspicion had made him step into her path in the first place. "Ma'am, I need you to stop moving and put your hands where I can see them." "I am not going to put my hands up while a boy is dying on a table 40 feet from here. Move." She tried to step around him a second time, and this time he caught her arm, not gently. The sudden physical contact jarring her stride and nearly sending her stumbling into the corridor wall. "I said, stop! Get your hands off me and let me do my job." Behind them, a nurse named Priya Sundaram, who had been jogging toward the trauma bay from the opposite direction and had caught the last 15 seconds of the confrontation, skidded to a halt with an expression of pure disbelief. "That's Dr. Freeman. She's the chief of surgery. Let her through. We need her in trauma too, right now." Kowalski's grip on Yolanda's arm didn't loosen. The particular, stubborn momentum of a man too committed to a course of action to process new information fast enough to change it. "I need to verify this first." "There's no time to verify anything." Priya's voice climbed toward genuine panic now, the seconds ticking away in a hallway that should have taken Yolanda 4 more strides to clear. "The patient is crashing. We need her now." Part 2. The minute that mattered. It took another full 30 seconds. 30 seconds Yolanda would later describe, in the incident report she filed with a controlled, clinical precision that belied the fury underneath it, as the longest 30 seconds of her professional life. Before Kowalski released her arm, and even then, he did it with the grudging reluctance of a man who still believed, on some level, that he'd been right to stop her in the first place. Yolanda didn't wait to see whether he'd fully processed the correction. She ran, Priya beside her, both of them covering the remaining 40 feet to Trauma Bay 2 in a matter of seconds, bursting through the doors to find a surgical team that had been holding, with increasing desperation, for a chief surgeon who should have arrived nearly 2 full minutes earlier than she actually did. "Where were you?" the anesthesiologist asked, already prepping, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "I was stopped," Yolanda said, snapping on gloves with hands that betrayed no tremor, despite what had just happened, her focus narrowing entirely onto the boy on the table, his blood pressure numbers scrolling across the monitor, in a range that left no margin for further delay. "We'll talk about it after. Talk me through his vitals, now." What followed was 90 minutes of surgery conducted at the outer edge of what the boy's body could survive, a margin that Yolanda would later state, in her formal report, had been narrowed by roughly 2 minutes that should never have been lost. 2 minutes spent arguing with a security officer in a restricted hallway, rather than at the operating table, where every second of her specific expertise mattered, in a way that no other surgeon on staff that night could fully replace. He survived. Barely, and only because the surgical team's skill and speed, once Yolanda finally reached them, had been sufficient to close the gap that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Samuel Okafor, learned of the incident the following morning through a channel considerably faster than any ordinary complaint process. A full, formal write-up from Yolanda herself, submitted before she'd even left the building, following a surgery that had ended successfully only because of a margin of skill she shouldn't have needed to draw on so heavily. "I want to be precise about what happened," Yolanda said, seated across from Okafor in his office, still in the same scrubs she'd worn into surgery 12 hours earlier, having not yet slept. "I was physically restrained by a security officer while responding to an active trauma page, after clearly identifying myself and my purpose multiple times. That restraint cost approximately 2 minutes in a case where every minute mattered. The patient survived. I want it understood, plainly, that his survival does not retroactively make what happened acceptable. It means we were fortunate, not that we were justified." Okafor, visibly shaken by the report's specifics, didn't attempt to minimize it. "I've already pulled the hallway camera footage. It corroborates everything in your account, in full. I want to understand something before we go further, though. Do you know this officer? Had there been any prior interaction?" "None. I'd never seen him before last night." Yolanda's expression tightened. "Which is, in some ways, the part that troubles me most. This wasn't personal animus built on any history between us. It was an instantaneous judgment, formed in less than a second, based on nothing except what he saw when he looked at me. A black woman, moving quickly through a restricted hallway. And that judgment held firm even after I identified myself, even after a nurse corroborated it, even while a patient's survival hung on the minutes he was costing us." Okafor pulled up the hospital's security contractor's records while she spoke, and what he found compounded the morning's growing alarm considerably further. Officer Kowalski had generated 3 prior complaints in his 11 months on the hospital rotation, each one alleging some version of exactly what had happened to Yolanda: an aggressive, unwarranted stop of a black staff member moving through a restricted area. Each complaint resolved through the contracting security firm's internal review with no more than a documented verbal counseling. None of them escalated to the hospital administration or the contracting firm's client oversight board. 3 prior incidents, Okafor said, reading through the file with a mounting, disbelieving anger. All with staff members. All resolved with essentially no consequence. And nobody thought to flag that pattern to us before assigning him to a rotation that put him directly in the path of exactly the kind of high-stakes, fast-moving medical response where seconds actually kill people. Part 3. What the contract required. The hospital's response, once the full scope of the pattern became clear, moved with a speed and thoroughness that stood in stark, deliberate contrast to the security contracting firm's own prior handling of Kowalski's file. Meridian General terminated its contract with the security firm's overflow staffing division within the week, a decision that carried significant financial and logistical cost, requiring an emergency transition to a new provider, but one the hospital board approved without meaningful debate, once Yolanda's report, corroborated by camera footage and Priya Sundaram's independent statement, made clear exactly what had been allowed to happen under the prior arrangement. Kowalski himself was terminated from the security firm entirely. The firm's own internal review, conducted this time under direct pressure from a major institutional client threatening to pull its business over the firm's prior handling of his file, finally applying the scrutiny that 3 previous complaints had never received. But Yolanda, once the immediate personnel questions had been resolved, pushed for something considerably broader than one officer's termination, a fight she carried into the hospital board's next quarterly meeting with the same precise, controlled intensity she brought to a difficult surgery. "I want the board to understand that firing one officer doesn't fix what actually failed here," she said, standing before the assembled trustees, a slide already projected behind her, showing the 3 prior complaints Kowalski had generated over 11 months. 3 incidents over less than a year, all involving staff of color, all resolved with no meaningful consequence and no escalation to us. That means our own contracting relationship with hospital security has, for at least 11 months, operated without any mechanism ensuring we were informed when a pattern like this was building among the officers working in our own restricted trauma areas. I am not asking you to fix Officer Kowalski. He's already gone. I'm asking you to fix the blind spot that let him stay in this building for 3 complaints before a 4th one nearly cost a 16-year-old boy his life. The board's response, formalized over the following 2 months, established a new oversight requirement written directly into every future security contracting agreement. Any complaint alleging discriminatory conduct by contracted security personnel would trigger automatic, mandatory disclosure to hospital administration within 72 hours, regardless of how the contracting firm's own internal review ultimately resolved it. A structural fix designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of quiet, unescalated pattern that had let 3 prior warnings pass unnoticed by anyone with the authority to actually address them. The 16-year-old patient, whose name Yolanda kept private in every account she gave of the incident afterward, recovered fully over the following months, a fact she cited whenever the story came up, not as evidence that the delay hadn't mattered, but as a reminder of exactly how narrow the margin had been. "People want to make this story simpler than it is," she said, in the single interview she gave to a medical journal covering the incident as part of a broader piece on healthcare security practices. "It would be easy to frame it as, everything worked out, the patient lived, so where's the harm? The harm is that it very nearly didn't work out. And it very nearly didn't work out specifically because of 2 minutes that should never have been lost, spent arguing with someone whose only actual basis for stopping me was an assumption he formed before I'd said a single word. I got lucky that my team's skill was enough to close a gap that shouldn't have existed. The next doctor stopped in that hallway, on a different night, with a different patient and a smaller margin, might not be as lucky. That's not a story about one bad officer. It's a story about how much depends on institutions actually looking closely enough to catch a pattern before it costs someone everything, rather than after." Priya Sundaram, the nurse whose intervention in the corridor had likely shaved crucial seconds off Yolanda's eventual arrival at the trauma bay, was later commended formally by the hospital board for what the citation described as decisive advocacy under pressure. A phrase Yolanda privately felt undersold exactly what Priya's willingness to speak up, immediately and without hesitation, had actually meant in a hallway where hesitation, from anyone, could easily have cost a life. Dr. Yolanda Freeman continued leading Meridian General's surgical department in the years that followed, the incident becoming, in her own private accounting, less a story about vindication than a permanent, working reminder of exactly how much unexamined assumption could cost in a building where seconds were never merely seconds, where every delay, however brief, however seemingly minor to the person causing it, landed somewhere specific, on someone specific, whose survival had never had any margin to spare in the first place. The end.